Albert Einstein said, in the midst of a crisis, let there be a great opportunity. Well, or at least something like that. So the question is, during this time of national crisis, is there an opportunity to rebuild this country?
A clear path forward requires looking back and learning. Good public policy requires human connection. It's a consideration of the facts, applying common sense and innovation. It's urban, it's rural, it's real life. We all have something to contribute. We all have a responsibility to get informed because there's a little piece of Canada in all of us, isn't there? Let's learn on this path together. This is Leaders on the Frontier.
So, with me here today to talk about Canada in crisis and is there an opportunity to rebuild this great nation is our friend Dr. Barry Cooper, who's a political scientist with the University of Calgary. He's an author, well-known analyst, and certainly a friend of Frontier. A warm welcome to you, Barry.
Good to be here.
Well, Barry, I'm excited about this conversation because I know that you have a lot of insight in terms of Canada at so many levels, both economic and certainly from a governance perspective, and you study these issues carefully. So I want to just, before we get into kind of a prescription, if you will, if you think of a patient seeing a doctor and the actions that need to be taken to get our policy house in order, I'd like to go through some basic questions. One would be, is Canada in a crisis today in 2025?
I would refine it somewhat and say that Laurentian Canada is in a crisis today. I don't think that Alberta is in a crisis. I think we're actually in a pretty good place to be. It will take such a leap of imagination from our fellow citizens in Quebec and Ontario to come up with something that would be acceptable, I think, to the rest of the country. I think they've got the problem. We don't.
Oh, interesting. So you'd say that the rest of Canada, in particular, Alberta, is in a good position, but the Laurentian elite, so to speak, are in crisis. Now, what do you mean by Laurentian elite? Help us understand what you mean by that term.
Well, I think it was demonstrated very clearly with the Premier of Ontario calling an election. He did that because he thought he could run against President Trump. He also, and those around him, and I would include people in Ottawa as well, started talking about particularly the oil and natural gas in Alberta and Saskatchewan to a lesser extent as being Canadian. That, to say the least, is highly presumptuous, since the Premier of Quebec and the Premier of Saskatchewan have said that they do not want oil and gas to be part of any retribution that these people in Ontario and Quebec might think up. So that's the big divide. It hasn't changed.
All right. So, gosh, there's a lot to unpack there, as they say. Not the least of which is the last time I checked our quote Constitution, including the British North America Act, resources are owned by, was it again? Oh, yeah, the provinces. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's what it says. Yeah.
Okay. So now that we've got that clarified, I mean, sincerely, I know that you are a Canadian patriot. I know that we share a vision, like so many Canadians, that we should be realistically the wealthiest, freest nation in the world. And I don't say that in terms of overstatement, but surely there's the opportunity to rebuild. It seems like Canada has been on a state of decline. And yes, it seems like we don't have as much unity as we should. I mean, it seems like there's been, frankly, a lot of efforts to divide this country based on superfluous pieces of identity like race or, all kinds of woke kind of criteria. So I want to talk with you about Canada itself and where we're at, given these challenges of a new U.S. administration. And I want to read to you a little bit of a quote from a friend of mine. Her name is Diane Francis, and she said in a recent column, a decade ago, I wrote a book called Merger of the Century, Why Canada and America Should Become One Country. The thesis was that the two countries were slowly merging and that Canada had become dependent, e.g., like a colony, on the United States for military protection, investment, and trade, and Canada had also failed to develop its natural resources, including the Arctic. So my question to you is that a fair analysis? Are we at that kind of existential moment as a country? And are we going to, these are my words, not hers, are we going to grow up as a nation and get our act together?
Yeah, I think I remember reading Diane France's book shortly after it came out, and my sense was that she's about a generation too late. I think that we became so dependent on the United States um, during and then after World War II that that might have been the time for Canada to actually have a more coherent voice vis-a-vis the United States, because after World War II, we had the third largest navy in the world. The RCIF
Mhm.
had first echelon interception roles, and we actually had a military. Um, the economy was doing fairly well, not quite as well as the Americans, but well enough. Um, and there was the possibility that since Canada was on the winning side uh, in World War II, we did have a major role in D-Day. That Canada could have done much more than it actually did during the late 1940s and early 1950s. We were there with the Americans in Korea, um, and then we sort of we maintained some forces in Europe for a while, but our actual contributions tended to fall off, and we started relying more and more on the United States, and for perfectly good reasons. The Americans were quite willing to protect us, and we were quite happy to let them. That probably was not the brightest long-term strategy, but that's what we followed. So there was a genuine, I think, genuine opportunity for Canada to reorient its internally itself. Um, Here, the problem was that during the war, Ottawa got used to running things. And with Keynesian economics being the kind of civil theology of the senior bureaucrats in Ottawa, that was continued after uh, after World War II, and the provinces lost expertise. I'm not sure that they ever had that much, but whatever they had disappeared. And the provinces were willing then to give up um, to Ottawa effective control over their own economy. So, there were opportunities there, but they weren't taken, and they might have been.
Okay, so that's fascinating. So if I'm understanding it correctly, so part of this is there's a kind of a centralization of power that went from, well, the provinces that really created Ottawa. Um, so there's a lot of centralization of power. And you had a famous economist, John Maynard Keynes, that basically said, well, you can go into deficit spending more, essentially, and that would offset lower economic times. But obviously, that opened up the spigots of a lot more spending and a lot more taxation. So there's a lot of things that have gone hand in hand. On top of that, we took on kind of a posture that we'll be content as a country, as a Canada, to become kind of a protectorate of the United States and kind of what would you say, freeload on American defense. Is that an accurate
Yes,
statement?
yes, somewhat understated, but yes,
Okay, well
we
I can say
certainly
it in
did.
other terms too.
We did, even including NORAD, uh, which is on paper anyways, a joint Canada-U.S. operation. Um, and there is uh, the senior commander of NORAD historically has alternated between a Canadian and American. I mean, interestingly enough, the guy who was in charge on 9/11 was a Canadian. Um,
Hmm.
but in fact, it has been basically an American combatant command for at least a
Hmm.
good generation or two.
Well, and it's really humbling. I have had the opportunity to get to know my friend, the Lieutenant General Michel Maisonneuve. He's obviously been highly decorated as a general. He even won the Vimy Ridge, the Vimy Award, recognizing his long service. And he would emphasize that Canada has systematically, the last number of years, withdrawn from the world. We're no longer seen as a reliable ally within NATO and certainly with the U.S. So it's pretty humbling apple pie to learn that when you look at that kind of reality. So the point is that this so-called national crisis, and you would define it as more with the Laurentian elites, has certainly not emerged recently. It's happened over a generation or two. So this has not just simply happened over the last few years. It's taken quite a while. Is that your point, Dr. Cooper?
Yeah, exactly. And again, the evidence, when if you actually make a list of the alleged complaints of President Trump with respect to Canada, every one of them, first of all, it's a fairly accurate list, but every one of the things that he's complaining about, if Canada were a self-respecting country, they would have taken care of already. Like having a non-porous northern border, for example. We haven't done that. For whatever reasons that the government of Canada can come up with, it hasn't been done. We haven't been pulling our weight in NATO. Any number of these things. We have not been a good ally to the Americans. So finally, when they chose a, let's say, frank-speaking president who points this out, since Canadians have never wanted to admit such terrible things, everybody freaks out and they think that he's the problem. He's not the problem. We're the problem. Look in the mirror, Canada, and you'll see everything that he said is true.
Wait a sec. You're saying that it's not quite so simple because, like I certainly enjoy watching hockey, as you probably do too, as any self-respecting Canadian. And I've heard the boos of, well, the American national anthem and vice versa now. It's kind of pathetic. But in that context, there's a whole host of, quote, grievances. It sounds like Festivus from Jerry Seinfeld. But these grievances have been around for quite a long time. It's not like Obama showed up in the parliament and didn't talk about the need to, frankly, have more Canada. That was all directed to the need to get our Defense Act together, among other issues. So this has been around for quite a while. But Donald Trump has a different style as a new administration, and they're intent on getting things done, not just talking about it. So help us understand that as Canadians, because I think we're frankly kind of emotionally, some of us are a bit upset. Like I thought we were best friends, and then our American allies turn around and we seem kind of shunned and we're kind of resentful of that. But help us understand these grievances. You said you get the border in shape, NATO and trade issues. Is that kind of the list of grievances that you're understanding?
Yeah, I mean, take any one of them that you wish and simply unpack it. The evidence is overwhelming. The style of President Trump is certainly much more direct than anything we're used to. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't have paid attention to, say, what I don't know, people from Jimmy Carter on have said about the way we've been running the country. I mean, for
Even
example,
Jimmy Carter? No kidding.
yeah,
I didn't know that.
You can go back as far as you want, practically. I was going to say John F. Kennedy, but if you would just take something like supply management of eggs and pork and milk and cheese and butter, that has been a major problem with not just with the United States, but with every time we've tried to negotiate some kind of trade agreement. And that means it doesn't mean Alberta. It doesn't mean Saskatchewan. It doesn't really mean anything other than Quebec. And no politician in this country ever wants to take on, except maybe, what's his name, Bernier. But let's say he's not mainstream. Almost everyone else has said, no, this is sacred. We will never negotiate that. It's a completely internal political choice that they're making. It has nothing to do with whether or not we're ever going to get any kind of decent agreement in terms of international trade. And everybody has known this, but nobody wants to talk about it. That's called cowardice. That's simple political cowardice.
Wow. So you're challenging us to think through what are the real issues and to listen and pay attention as we kind of now face a major threat to our economy and way of life here. So this doesn't happen overnight here. And I guess the question is having, like, we'll get into those details further in our conversation, Dr. Cooper. But in this case, though, do you think there's an opportunity for Canada to get with the program, become a full ally, to grow up, if you will, and become really a continental partner in terms of prosperity and opportunity with the U.S.? Is that the opportunity?
That's absolutely the opportunity. Uh, Personally, I don't think that we have any politician in this country who's willing to see it as an opportunity. It's unfortunate, but I think that's part of the lay of the land.
Mm.
Certainly, there's no liberal. You wouldn't even expect a liberal to do that because of their commitment to all of these international sorts of things. Um, but I was very disappointed in Pierre Poilievre. He's kind of agreed that it's all the Americans' fault. Uh, they're the
Mm.
ones who've made the changes. There was a I'll give you another example. In the Financial Post this morning, there was an article, a column by Terry Corcoran, and he said, "I don't understand the motivations of President Trump." And I thought, Terry, he has been saying what the motivations are for the past 8, 10 years. Make America great
Mm.
again. Like,
Yeah.
what
So
does he not
what
understand?
does that mean, Barry? Yeah. So what does
It
make
means putting
America great again?
it means putting America first, which is this other way of formulating his vision for the United States. And to say that we don't understand that is shows either let's say disingenuousness or a remarkable
Mhm.
lack of imagination. I mean, it's really clear
Okay.
what the Americans are
Yeah.
going to do.
Yeah, and so to be clear, and I wasn't trying to be overly facetious, but yeah, "Make America Great Again" is set within a particular urgency that people feel within the domestic scene of the United States to basically rebuild the prosperity of middle America, of the middle class, to be able to ensure that people have good paying jobs and not just simply offshore them, but to also deal with, well, very real security issues, including the hundreds of thousands of Americans that have died because of fentanyl death. So these are very top of mind issues, and this is so it behooves us as Canadians. I think what you're getting at is very insightful, Barry. Is that we need to understand the U.S. domestic political scene, not our own lens of looking through them. That, well, it's just as simple as, well, Orange Man bad, and that this is somebody who's creating all these plans on the back of an envelope on their desk in the White House. That's not that simple, is it?
No, it's not. And to think that it is, I also think is sort of self-serving narcissism among Canadian politicians. It's a refusal to consider the other guy and how he sees things,
Right.
and you have to do that when you're a very junior partner on the continent, a very junior partner in terms of the economy, not even a partner at all in terms of defense, and we just refuse to do it. So you have a
Mhm.
very smart guy like Terry Corcoran saying that, which makes
Hmm.
absolutely no sense.
Okay,
I don't
so
why he did it. I have
gosh,
no
we
idea.
need to we need to up our game. It sounds like you're saying that we need to elevate our level of thinking and analysis so we can actually be better. What would it be? Oh yeah, negotiators as we face this new administration. And so I think part of this also has been said many times. So certainly I've said it many, many times. Is that surely this is an opportunity to rebuild Canada, to strengthen it for the sake of the next generation as we face massive decline. So I want to get your help to understand what are some of the key actions we need to take from an economic point of view. Like, for example, we have this enormous asset of natural resources, among others, that we've underdeveloped. Like the whole notion that we don't even have proper pipelines to Tidewater, to larger international markets, when we have the international community, including Germany, Japan, Greece, gosh, I've missed probably a half a dozen others, that want our resources. So how do we speed that up, Barry? What's the solution?
This is where I'm rather less optimistic, I think, than perhaps you are. Uh, I consider most of the things that you mentioned uh, are, again, not national problems. They're problems with the refusal of Laurentian Canadians, not just the quote unquote elites, but ordinary citizens in Quebec and Ontario who support these guys, uh, to acknowledge that there has been a change in the past generation, just in terms of economic clout and let's say imaginative clout within the country. It's not Quebec and Ontario anymore. It's Alberta and Saskatchewan, and maybe a few people in British Columbia, but not as many as one would have liked. Um, that has been a huge imaginative challenge to the Laurentians because their entire historical understanding of what the country is shaped by and looks like is that it all comes from the Laurentian region of the country. It's a failure of imagination, I think, uh, on their part, not on ours. I mean, people in Alberta are very confident, um, but that means that citizens, fellow citizens elsewhere in the country, are going to have to make some adjustments, and they have refused to do that. Um,
Hmm.
that's why they come up with these pseudo psychological terms like alienation to describe what's the matter with those people out there. I mean, there's another
Hmm.
dismissive kind of image, rather than say maybe we should listen to people in Edmonton for a change. And what does Danielle Smith
Okay.
have to say?
Eh, So you're getting at something not only in terms of public policy narrowly defined, like getting the pipelines done, getting our taxes to be competitive, to be able to frankly move forward our nation on all cylinders, but also unite as a country. Is that basically what you're getting at? Is that we have
Exactly.
we're really not united as as a country? It sounds like we got to become a family again. Or were we ever a family, Barry?
Well, we can talk about whether we were ever a family in a minute, but if you ask yourself, where does the opposition to all of those economic things that you mentioned, like pipelines, where does it come
Hmm.
from? Uh, we know perfectly well where it comes from. It comes from Quebec, chiefly, and the ideological, let's say, commitments of Quebec ministers. They have, I don't know, think that they have some kind of moral high ground because they have hydroelectricity, which they now call clean, whereas what comes from out of the ground in Alberta and Saskatchewan is somehow dirty. Well, that's
Interesting.
moralizing the whole problem of energy.
Okay, so this is ironic because we share a lot of money across our nation in the form of equalization payments, largely from, well, frankly, the West to other recipients, including Quebec. And interesting enough, the formula is very complicated, but it doesn't include what is it called again? Yes, hydroelectric generation in that formula, does it? Is that what you're getting at? Is that it's kind of a one-way ticket to shovel money from one part of the country to another?
That's exactly what it is, and there are other aspects of inter-regional fiscal transfers that have nothing to do with the sort of equalization stuff. Um, Things like social and medical transfers. That's also paid
Hmm.
disproportionately, or unemployment or employment insurance, as we call it now. Uh, that is disproportionately paid, particularly by the workforce in this province. Um, those things are not addressed because it's not in the interests of Ontario and Quebec to do so. So they don't, um,
Okay,
because a lot of
so just
people live there.
on that, so just to pick up on that point, is another example that you're getting at, Barry, is the whole issue that ironically, when we're talking about the threat of tariffs, we don't have free trade among provinces, and that really affects every Canadian in the tune of several $1,000s per household because well, that represents at least 3 to 4%, depending on your estimate, of our economy. So that's like kind of a no-brainer. So is there a reason why you don't believe we have free trade in Canada?
Uh, well, for two reasons. One, it's by and large, it's not in the interest of most of the provinces to do that. And secondly, they have been bolstered in their ability to construct these internal trade barriers by the Supreme Court of Canada. Uh, in fact, this province probably has the fewest uh, interprovincial trade barriers of anybody, and we've benefited by it because if you're a carpenter and just across the way in BC and there's houses to be built there, you can come and you don't have to go through a bunch of recertification. There are all kinds of things that uh, I would say Alberta has led the way on, of which about which most Canadians are totally in the dark. Um, but that eventually, I think it's because of the vision that comes out of central Canada with respect to the quote periphery, whether it's the Maritimes or anything west of Etobicoke.
All right. So you're getting at something deeper here. You're saying that, if I'm understanding you correctly, Dr. Cooper, that, hey, Canada needs to get its act together, build those pipelines, get our taxes under control, have free trade. But it's a symptom of a mindset of the so-called Laurentian elites who largely run the country, so to speak, that are centered on Ontario and Quebec, and not to vilify anybody, but it's a mindset that is holding back our country. So you're challenging us to say, hey, the larger vision for this renewal should involve everybody. Is that really what you're getting at?
I think that the larger vision is called federalism, uh,
Ah,
and that means treating the provinces equally, um, and that is, I would say, is a problem of imagination for Central Canadians. It's not our problem. It really is theirs. And if they are unable to do that, and so far they haven't been able to do very much along those lines anyway, nothing serious will ever change. Um, at least not internally. So, I mean, as well as I do the number of alternatives just in the last generation about, say, a triple E Senate. What was that about?
hmm.
What was about
What's a
having
Triple E Senate? Can you remind us
the
of what a
elected
Triple E
equal,
Senate is?
elective, effective, and equal? That was Preston Manning's, and it was a generation ago. The purpose of that was to restore federalism to the country,
Hmm.
and it
Hmm.
needed restoration because historically, particularly the western provinces have not been accorded the same kind of status as the big two Laurentian provinces, or for that matter, Atlantic Canada as well. And there are historical reasons for it, but those reasons are historical. They're not present now. The country has
Mm.
changed, but the structures by which we govern ourselves haven't. And until that happens, you're going to have the same kind of problems that we have, which is, on the one hand, I would say, and this is what I think you've been alluding to, a kind of paralysis at the center and an enormous amount of discontent, um, particularly in the productive parts of the West.
Okay, so this is a fascinating moment in Canadian history, and I like the way you're challenging us to not only get our policy house in order, getting our engine on all cylinders in both the economic and social policy, but also getting the federation working properly. So you've alluded to one solution, and that is, well, for example, the Canadian Senate is kind of well, I'm not even sure what its role is today, other than potentially to obstruct as the prime minister makes even more appointments on his way out, which is frankly a bit of a red flag. But what are the solutions to getting our federal system working better? Is there an easy answer to that, Barry?
Um, I don't think there is not only an easy answer, I don't even think there's an answer. Um, and the reason is because one of the most difficult things for any individual and certainly any collectivity to undertake is to change the assumptions by which they live together. Um, and we've seen this historically all over the place. We've seen it in the last generation or two in Europe as well. But it's an extremely difficult thing to do. It takes a kind of crisis that comes to a head, um, which is very unpleasant for everyone. And it's not as
Mm.
if we don't understand what the problems are, because we do. I mean, that's what all we've been doing is talking about them, and we know what needs to be done, which is to say to confront them. And that takes, as I said, that takes courage. It doesn't take intelligence to figure out what the problems are. It takes courage to deal with them. And until Canadians somehow or other find that, we're just going to be talking about, oh, things are getting terrible and they're going to get worse and blah blah blah.
Okay. But the reality is that Canada is in a vulnerable situation. We're kind of in a weakened state as our economy has relatively low productivity. In fact, the income gap between the United States and Canada is stunningly divergent. I mean, we've got like a 25, depending on the state that you examine in the provincial income, easily between 25, $35,000 differential. I mean, this is huge, and historically, it's been fairly close to each other. So, as the United States pursues more economic activity and growth, it behooves us to pursue economic opportunities and growth as well. But we're kind of hamstrung because we have a federal system that acts as a full brake on the ability for Canada to prosper. Is that another way to look at
Yes, it certainly is. Uh, Think of what kind of an imaginative leap it would have to anyone, you and me both, but anyone, uh, I don't know, somebody writing for the Globe and Mail. Um, what would it take for an author of an op-ed to say, we should be very grateful to President Trump for pointing out this, that we can't continue to exist as a country without confronting these real issues. Now,
it?
I mean,
Mm.
there would be uh, that would be something to really contemplate. Let's say, and I can't
Mhm.
imagine any Canadian. I mean, I might do it just for fun, but I can't imagine any Canadian actually doing that.
All right. So we probably shouldn't hold our breath to see if the Globe and Mail thanks President Trump for being a challenge to us to deal with our internal problems. Okay. Well, that's another take on things. So speaking of challenges, I think you're alluding to another issue, and that is the whole issue of the legacy media. We know full well that this federal government has chosen to systematically fund some 2,000 outlets, the last time I checked, including the Globe and Mail. Um, it's a lot of money. It's well over, I believe, $1 billion, and that doesn't even include the CBC. So, I mean, isn't that a problem right there? If you fund the media to carry water for your basic narratives, then gosh, then a lot of the country's left out of that mix. We don't really have the information it takes to really have a honest, healthy discussion in this country. Is that part of the dynamic that you would cite as well?
Yeah, I haven't done any media studies for quite a while, but I have written a couple of books. One with Lydia Melchan, who was a former student of mine. She's at Windsor, um, and there's always been a real problem with the media. Uh, I mean, particularly self-important columnists um, who think that everybody should listen to them. Uh, they are what, in a pejorative sense, we call intellectuals rather than scholars, and they have always been a problem. The
Mhm.
government sees the problem of the media as an opportunity. I mean, the minister in charge of CBC said today, front page of the National Post, we're going to give CBC even more money.
Oh, yes, right.
Why would they do that? Because they think that CBC is their voice. I mean, there's no other reason
Exactly.
for doing it.
Mhm. Well, we've
And
lost sight
everybody
of.
knows that too.
Yes, no, exactly, and this is not a partisan comment. If you look at the governance model that has enabled really most Western countries to succeed, is that you need healthy states, including a media that is independent, that's not on the dole, that can speak truth to power. I mean, isn't that it?
That used to be the whole point of what they used to call the fourth estate. They were not lapdogs of the government of the day,
Exactly.
and that's what they are today.
So
And
that,
again,
again,
this is not news.
yeah,
Everybody knows it.
exactly. So, in this age of massive deficits and debt, and given these economic challenges, you think that would be an easy one to cut, wouldn't it?
Um, and here again, we can look at how the Americans have led the way with Doge. Of course, it would be.
Hmm.
It would be easy to cut. Um, Most Canadians would be happy to see it cut. Uh, as with any number of other, I mean, if Canada ever appointed a Doge type committee, uh, you can be sure that proportionately there would be way more uh, fat to be cut from the bureaucracy. I mean, the growth of bureaucracy under the last two Trudeau governments uh, has come to the attention even of the mainstream media, and
Hmm.
they've said maybe that's a little too much. Um,
Hmm.
of course it's not just a little too much; it's a lot too much.
Hmm.
And it would be nice to see a national politician say, "We want. We may not be able to get Elon Musk to do it, but uh, we could certainly find some other Canadian businessman who understands that how to get rid of people." I mean, Kevin O'Leary comes to mind pretty quickly.
Hmm.
You can be sure that he would delight in
Hmm.
accepting a commission for maybe $1 a year to cut the size of the central bureaucracy,
Yeah, indeed.
and
Isn't
he
that
would be
something?
applauded for it.
Yeah, no, it'd be a remarkable breakthrough. I mean, that's the point. If you care about our country and you care about the value for money that you're offering to your people, then it's healthy to keep reviewing those budget lines and how the money's spent. And I guess one of the things I marvel at within the federal system now is the amount of money, the tens of millions of dollars going out to kind of a network of not-for-profit groups that are kind of proxies for the government's policy narratives. Some refer to this as the woke-topus. Does that is that what you're getting at as well? Is to review and get rid of that kind of patronage funding that just funds pressure groups and people that basically carry the narrative of a partisan government?
Yes, and I would add to that the let's call them the somewhat lunatic environmentalist groups as well,
Hmm.
who are also lavishly funded by the government of Canada, or rather by the taxpayers of Canada, uh, many of whom would oppose much of the policy advocacy that they come up with. So yeah, I think it would not take a genius like Elon to find plenty of money to be extracted from these kinds of groups. Again, this is common knowledge. This is not some kind of conspiracy, or it's not some kind of deep revelation that no one knew this. People have known this for ages. I mean, for example, the Court Challenges program. Um,
Mm.
when Stephen Harper became prime minister, that was the first program they cut. And the Court Challenges program was basically a way of funneling taxpayers' money to opposition groups to allow them then to pay for litigation for um, uh, legal challenges that they thought were in the interests of mostly the left. Uh,
Sorry, just
and
to clarify, so the Court Challenges program was essentially the government cynically funding groups that they allied with so that they could in turn challenge the government's law.
exactly, yes, it is. Um, Ian Brody, who was Stephen Harper's chief of staff, wrote his thesis on the Court Challenges program, and he said it is the state in court with itself, which means basically the taxpayers are funding both sides.
Wow.
And
So kind
it
of a
was one of
cynical
the
game,
dumbest.
really.
Well, yes, a
Yeah.
very
So
cynical
it's not
game.
about public policy, it's about short-term politics to basically do what you felt you had to do to quote win. But it's not necessarily serving the Canadian people. That's the problem, isn't it? Wow.
And it was also a way of trying to get policies in place that were not popular and that would not be passed by Parliament. So if Parliament is not going to respond to these goofy ideas, go to
Mhm.
court. Judges, they'll listen to anything. And that's what they did. They were able to hire clever lawyers, and the clever lawyers got the not always that clever judges to listen to them.
Yeah, pretty disappointing, cynical stuff. So speaking of which, we have a parliament during this so-called national crisis. We certainly, would define crisis as something that a time that is abnormal. And we've got certainly all kinds of elected officials running around that would define Canada in a kind of a crisis. But yet Parliament is not working. We have this so-called proroguing of the Parliament. What do you think about that? Shouldn't Parliament be back to work?
I think everybody except those who adored Justin Trudeau realized why Parliament was prorogued, because he would have been turfed out if it had
Mm,
still if Parliament had still been in session. That was an expression of the continuing crisis. It's not itself particularly a crisis; it's just more of the same,
mhm.
and it's not being cynical. It's I would say it's just being realistic with respect to uh, well, corruption is the right term, but I don't mean monetary corruption. I mean
Mhm.
a kind of spiritual disorder. Machiavelli talked about corrota, and that's what seems to govern not just the recent governments, but a very large number of members of parliament, whether they're in the opposition or
Mm.
on the government side. And I don't know that there's much of a cure for that, quite frankly. Um, you can
So are you
send other
getting,
guys to.
so if I understand you, Dr. Cooper, correctly, you're kind of getting at the whole point that it's not just about the written letter of the law or the principles of public policy, but it's something even deeper to the human psyche and practice and traditions of our country, namely honor. How do we treat each other honorably in the interest of governance? Because I know that is that what you're getting at? Honorable conduct?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, that is the in political science. We have a term from Aristotle called politia, which generally
Yes,
translated as regime. And
indeed.
the regime, uh, when it is so dysfunctional, to use a sociological term that is quite neutral, I would say when it's so corrupt, uh, that simple exhortation is not going to make much of a difference because the people
Mm.
involved will not listen, and if they do listen, they won't understand. And I don't know what you can do about that.
Okay, but in this context, you have written incisively about the decline in the trust of Canadian institutions. But is this not all related? Like, if we can't have institutions that serve us well, that create an affordable, hope filled life where we can raise a family and have a future, and if we don't have the hope that institutions are acting honorably in our interest, then how do we turn this around?
Well, that's the problem. Quite frankly, that is the entirety of the problem. When the government has acted in such a way that they do not deserve your trust, and we've talked about things like funding uh, mainstream media, like the Court Challenges program, like any number
Mhm.
uh, of really harmful policy patterns. When the government has done that, and the newspapers have been, the regular newspapers have not been telling the truth about it, um, then ordinary citizens simply withdraw their allegiance. Uh, Maybe their allegiance to the country, certainly their allegiance to any particular government. Um, and they start looking for other sources where they can find precisely the kinds of support that gives them confidence that they're not wasting their money and their time trying to fix things. How that happens, I don't know.
Well, it very much concerns me. This is where I spend a lot of time, my waking hours, thinking about, because I think it matters in terms of the future of this country. I think in the capital markets, we've seen this the last 10 years, the flight of capital of a stunning $1.3 trillion from this country. If we don't have business, if we don't have an economy, we don't have a future. And at the same time, it's deeper than that. It's if we lose our people, if we lose people, leaders who help build, entrepreneurs who help move things forward, if we lose a variety of our people, then our future as a country is dim. And therefore, the question ultimately is whether we will choose to, as citizens, engage in the democratic process and help rebuild this country. Isn't that ultimately the answer?
No, absolutely. It's exactly the answer. And one of the things is it's often academics forget is that our job is to discuss things, is to analyze, and it's up to citizens to actually undertake the action. I mean, I can do it as a citizen, but it's not on the basis of any deep analysis of the problem, because the problems don't require deep analysis. The problems are so obvious that the amazing thing is that you have people particularly in the media, since that's where most opinions get formed, saying they don't understand when they understand perfectly well, or else, again, they're being disingenuous or completely unimaginative. The problems are not that difficult to understand. What's difficult is to do anything about it. But that's not, I would say that's not the job of academics to provide leadership, political leadership. That's what politicians are for. Statesmen, we used to call them, but we haven't had too many statesmen in this country for some time.
Well, look, we've had a far-reaching conversation today, and I would say not just one of the mind, but one of the heart, Barry. And I want to thank you very much for your leadership and for joining us today for this important conversation as we talk about how to renew this country.
You're welcome. It was good talking with you.
Thank you for watching Leaders on the Frontier. We're a nonpartisan think tank. We explore ideas, policy, and practical solutions that can make a difference in the lives of Canadians. We do not accept any government funding. We work for you. Thank you for supporting Frontier. Visit fcpp.org to give. While you're there, be sure to check out our latest articles and research. Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.